America Chavez has been adored as a character throughout her many support roles in several team-based comic book series. However, when her solo series came, there were definitely some mixed opinions on the narrative style and literary elements that writer Gabby Rivera decided to incorporate into America's first solo series. Personally, having both admired America Chavez as a Latina superhero and studied Spanish literature for years now, I found myself loving and appreciating many of the elements of the story that unhappy readers found controversial about the series. In my opinion, the America series reads much better as Latin American literature than as a stereotypical comic book storyline. Particularly, three main facets of Latin American literature really stand out as being key to having a better appreciation, or at least a better understanding, of Rivera's work on the series. The literary history behind Latin America spans the history of the continent itself, but many literary critics believe there's a distinct difference between Latin American literature and literature that was simply written in Latin America. To talk about Latin American literature, it helps to start with one of the very first literary movements that Latin America grew to truly own and identify themselves with, el modernismo. Not to be confused with modernism, El Modernismo was a pan-Latin American movement that arose out of a conscious sense of being threatened by both empires from the United States and from Spain. From this sense of dread and pressure, many Latin American citizens began to ask the question of what it meant to be Latin American in the first place. They didn't just want to be an extension of Spanish identity, especially after having just separated themselves from them politically, but they also didn't identify with the United States, who were just trying to barge in and take over their way of life. And so writers from all across the Spanish-speaking continent came to answer the question of Latin American identity through a mix of poetry, novels, and essays. These writers gave this general answer to describe Latin American identity: an adoration of art and spirit. This is what El Modernismo emphasizes. Uruguayan author José Enrique Rodó practically defined Latin American modernismo in his novel Ariel, which happens to follow similar narrative beats as the beginning of the America series. Ariel is a novel directed mostly towards the youth of Latin America and presents itself in the form of an ongoing seminar between several students, a philosophy teacher, and a muse-like statue by the name of Ariel. The teacher, referred to as Próspero, gives his lecture to his students by discussing the artistic beauty and spirituality that the statue of Ariel symbolizes, and goes on to insist that his students should live their lives pursuing the same ideals that Ariel represents: Parnassian art and humanist spirituality. Coincidentally enough, the first issue of America starts off with a question of identity similar to the task that Rodó takes on for Latin America. The comic begins with the question, "Who is America to you?" And from then on, the story follows America Chavez's journey to grow and learn more about herself by becoming a university student and seeking out a mentor. This mirrors how the students of Ariel study under the guidance of Próspero in order to learn more about themselves, and similarly enough, America goes through this academic journey by becoming a far more humanist and spiritual person. Another virtue that mentor Próspero teaches his students is the rejection of what he calls nordomania. Nordomania, in this context, refers to an infatuation with a foreign culture that is so strong that the individual loses their sense of regional identity. We see America go through this same struggle of cultural identity when she continues through her life living on Earth, but always speaking about how she feels a melancholic emptiness inside because she doesn't have the same sense of legacy or heritage as her friends. However, once her grandmother Madre Mar comes into her life as a physical connection to her familial past, America has a firmer sense of identity and shows signs of joy because of it. Now, seeing as how America seems to align with many of Rodó's ideas about Latin American literature, I'd like to pose the following question. Comic book readers who disliked America's focus on spirituality and humanist character interactions deemed the series as antithetical to what they believed comic books to be: action-packed stories that focused on fights and clear-cut good versus evil. In Rodó's work, Próspero describes the antithesis to Ariel, which he attributes to the industrial and invasive United States of his time, as the character Caliban. He describes Caliban as being a representation of the utilitarian attitude of the United States of the late 1800s, and emphasizes that Latin America, and Ariel, stood in opposition to these North American values by rebelling against the dehumanizing culture of the industrial United States. Now, if in Rodot's essay, Ariel and Latin American culture are meant to contrast with Caliban and United States culture, then in a meta-literary context, could the America series be interpreted as rebelling against the stereotypical idea of what North American comic books are? While I doubt that this detail was intentional, I definitely think it adds to America's list of modernista characteristics, and contributes to the idea of America following the style of Latin American literature. Modernista elements aside, the America series shows attributes of Latin American literature according to other Hispanic scholars as well. One famous and most recent scholar being Mexican writer Carlos Fuentes. Fuentes was a 20th century Latin American author who focused on the subject of time in his stories, and for good reason too. When asked in an interview about his thoughts on the role time plays in his stories, Fuentes had this to say.
Well, I believe that Latin America, and notably Mexico, are fundamentally countries of simultaneous time periods. They are countries in which the culture exists within various temporal levels, and I participate in this fact, which is a fact that curiously gives modernity to Latin Americans, because the fact of having a consciousness of a past, and of a past that is present, that is, right there, is what makes us agree in such a powerful way with the modern novelists and literature.
Now, the America series, ringing true with Carlos Fuentes' thoughts on time as a motif in Latin American literature, takes a very special and intimate approach with time for America Chavez. Most notably, this comes in the form of America gaining the power of time travel. America Chavez experiences two simultaneous periods of time, literally, when she travels back in time to meet with her past self in the first encounter with an energy monster. During this scene, it is only by joining forces with her past and present selves, much in the same way of how her mothers join forces to save their world, that she is able to defeat the seemingly unbeatable energy monster she faces. Meanwhile, America also experiences two simultaneous periods of time metaphorically through the moments she spends with her grandmother Madre Mar. Madre Mar acts as a physical connection to America's heritage and history when she tells the young protagonist about her mother's childhoods, the legacy of their home planet, and even the creation myth surrounding their entire culture. In fact, this aspect seems to resonate most strongly with the latter part of Fuentes' interview.
They too showed themselves to be dissatisfied with the Western presentation of time, with the concept of time that is purely linear, logical, directed straight towards the future, and rejecting of the past. I believe that in order to have a present, and in order to have a future, one must have a past. To wish for only the future is to not have a future at all.
These many moments where America Chavez presents a keen consciousness of the past and of her heritage not only show themselves to be very core to her personal characterization, but also emphasize and celebrate the same mentalities towards time as Latin American literature does, according to Carlos Fuentes. But moving on to other literary facets of the series, I think it would be criminal to neglect one of the most famous literary genres of Latin American literature as it relates to the America series, magical realism. Magical realism is by far the most well-known type of narrative fiction that Latin American authors have provided, such as Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude, Isabel Allende's The House of Spirits, and dozens of other works by dozens of other authors. The genre is primarily defined as having a real-world setting that possesses some fantastic and magical elements that end up demonstrating a far more real facet of the narrative's world. However, I'd like to stress the fact that this is very much a loose definition, as some scholarly critics such as Luis Leal have gone so far as to say, if you can explain it, then it's not magical realism. Nevertheless, the notion of introducing something fantastic or magical to a real-world setting is still typically regarded as a key element to the genre of magical realism. And so this is what I'd like to relate to the America series. For example, in Garcia Marquez's short story, A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings, the narrative revolves around a small town coming into contact with the titular Old and Winged Man. Thinking him to be an angel, the story tells of how the townspeople abuse the old man, such as how they pluck feathers from his wings, thinking that they could cause miracles. In this narrative, the fantastic element of a winged man demonstrates the far more real aspects of the town's society by revealing their hypocrisies and selfish natures. Similarly, in America Chavez's series, the magic of her powers of teleportation incites a social fear and oppressive authority that seeks to restrain and defeat her out of a mix of jealousy and revenge. As one could imagine, the events and responses surrounding the magical elements of the genre typically has magical realist authors convey a political message or criticism towards society, which the America series does not shy away from. All in all, Gabby Rivera's work on America Chavez's first solo series was definitely distinct in the style and storytelling compared to most everyday superhero series. Her stories definitely strayed from the typical tropes and patterns of the superhero genre, and wound up being representative of some of the strongest themes of Latin American literature. The America series instead explores personal spirituality, the consciousness of how heritage and history mold the present, and how the magic of the Marvel Universe can reveal the realities of modern society. And so for having done all this, I really do think America Chavez had a good series.